Let us get one thing straight. You're never ordinary. Something about you stood out from the minute you entered this earth. The way you move, think, and stand out while others attempt to blend in. Some individuals felt it. Some people appreciated it. Some people dreaded it. Because of power, true strength does not need to declare itself. It simply exists. And that's why they gathered in dark corners and behind locked doors, murmuring your name as if it were a danger. They believed that if they planned hard enough and long enough, they would be able to change the course of your destiny. They felt that their jealousy, duplicity, and meticulously planned strategies might break you. But they didn't comprehend this. They were defeated when they moved against you because you exposed them. You were being looked over. You're untouchable. They believed they were invisible, but powers larger than them were listening. They believed they could script your demise. But the ink never reached the paper. And now the transition starts. The atmosphere shifts. The air thickens because this is the moment when everything works in your favor. Allow them to speak. Let them plan. Let them assume they have the upper hand. Nothing changes since it is of the finest quality. That's you. Nobody can take it away. The room recoiled, as if the walls knew something the people within didn't. The air thickened, pushing on their lungs and requiring respect. Then, like a fissure in reality, an invisible but irrefutable power emerged. Cut through the darkness, causing energy waves to spread across the area. What had seemed familiar only seconds before. The dim lights muted the murmuring. The illusion of control became strange and inconsequential. A huge power came, capable of shattering their determination. It did not speak in echoes or thunder, but its very existence crushed their confidence. A command, simple but unyielding. It has ingrained itself in their entire soul, piercing through their hubris like fire through frail paper. Do not extend your hand. The words did not need repeating. The meaning was definitive. Every meticulously crafted illusion crumbled in front of their eyes. Their ambitions are now impotent in the face of something immensely larger. Fear, raw and unadulterated, it took hold. The place that once afforded seclusion has become a prison. They were its inmates. Panic clutched at their throats as the need to flee overpowered all else. They had moved unchallenged for far too long, believing that quiet meant agreement. He seemed unconcerned about each step they made in secret. Their plans unfold without opposition. However, there is always a point at which patients' lives come to an end. There is always a moment when the invisible hand of justice moves. What they didn't comprehend was that they had already crossed that boundary. They mistook stillness for absence, forgetting that every whisper, lie, and choice had been seen. And now, as they stood shivering on the wrong side of an invisible boundary, they realized too late that they had never been free of consequences. What they wanted to claim, what they thought they could shatter, was never within reach. The force that they rejected as intangible has always surrounded itself. Shielding, guarding, and observing had unintentionally summoned the exact thing they should have dreaded the most. Their conviction in their own superiority had been their undoing. They felt they were untouchable for a minute, but then they sealed their reckoning. There would be no bargaining. A rapid change in the atmosphere. The breath was stolen from their lungs in a subtle but absolute manner. The change was not announced with wrath. It did not fall in anger. It came with a much more terrible finality. Their hands trembled before their thoughts could comprehend why words that had always been so easy to say felt like shards in their throats. The force that had entered the room needed no spectacular show or dramatic disclosure. It just was, and it alone was enough to demolish every untruth they had put up. The confidence that had propelled them minutes before crumbled under the weight of something indescribable. And then the words came, not in fury or menace, but in a tone that allowed no space for disobedience. This is the end. They had no protection against it. There was no argument to provide. The fundamental framework of their confidence had cracked, leaving them empty. They had not arrived here by coincidence, destiny, or a stroke of luck. They had created this moment for themselves via every choice, lie, and mistake. What they had regarded as impotent now appeared before them unequivocally, and they were left with just the irrefutable truth. They had overstepped, and there was no turning back. They sought to justify and beg. However, they had lost the capacity to act. A power bigger than words had descended upon them, imprisoning every idea, justification, and desperate effort at resistance inside their own heads. There was no place for dispute or rebellion. The decision had been given, and it was accompanied with a deeper understanding. It was absolute. This was more than just a chance to escape. It was the last moment before all pathways vanished completely. What had previously been confidence did not just go. It was destroyed. Something within them snapped. Something old, rooted in the very depths of life itself. It was such a thorough realization of domination over an authority that the body responded before the intellect had time to grasp it. This was not dread as they had known it before. This was a dread that was beyond reason, cognition, and survival itself. One of them tried to keep his limbs still, but his body betrayed him with shaking hands and a quivering breath. Another person clenched his hands, teeth crushing together. But it did little to mask the palpable terror surging through him. Someone took a stumbling step backward, as if instinct alone saw the need for space the most clearly. Among them, the one whose words had formerly dripped with hatred attempted to swallow. However, the dryness in his mouth made it a difficult endeavor. The air didn't just push down. It tightened around them like an unseen chain, compelling obedience. It was not heat, suffocation, or weight in the physical sense, but something quite other, an indisputable force that stripped them of their illusions. They had come in as hunters, but now they were nothing more than prey, vulnerable, weak, and completely at the mercy of what lay before them. Then one of them slumped, not from collision or tiredness, but as if his body sensed something. His mind refused to accept. The idea of standing in this presence had become unthinkable. Another staggered his breath, instinctively crying for escape despite the fact that no way out existed. A third lunged wildly for the wall, fingers scratching on rough stone, seeking to ground himself against the overpowering weight of the situation. There was no stability to be found, no place to hide, no whispered intentions to save the moment. Every meticulously planned strategy, every hidden maneuver, had crumbled in front of their own eyes. They had spent endless nights creating a universe in which they were in complete control, where everything bowed to their whim and the laws were determined by them. They had talked about their target as if they were inconsequential, as if their acts had no consequence. Beyond the game they imagined they were playing. But there was no laughing anymore. There were no words at all. Even the concept of speaking had gone remote. Impossible. Their own bodies had turned against them, revealing the depths of their terror in ways they couldn't control. They had persuaded themselves that there would be no consequences, that their deeds were undetectable, and that their power was limitless. But now, in the terrible stillness that followed, the truth loomed before them, unmistakable and irrevocable. What they had rejected as impotent had shattered their illusions in an instant, and there was no escape from what they had summoned. No weapon made against them will succeed, nor shall any voice rise against them in judgment. You must condemn. Isaiah 5417. It always begins the same way. The envious meet in secret, believing they can change what was never theirs to manage. They whisper, they plot, they walk in the shadows, thinking that their actions may change the future. But destiny is not something to be taken. Favors are not something you can bargain for. You do not take what God has provided. A candle does not battle against darkness. It just exists. In doing so, it triumphs. But what happens when people who like the darkness strive to extinguish it? They believe they have control. They believe their grasp is strong enough to contain what was intended to shine. However, when they attack or reach out, they discover a reality they were not expecting. Light cannot be extinguished by hands that were never supposed to touch it. One of them, the impetuous one, who had always believed that power belonged to those who grasped it, attempted to maintain his own fantasy. He clung to denial like a drowning man holding air, desperately seeking something that no longer existed. His mind swirled, looking for some explanation or justification to make sense of what was happening. He wanted to protest, "This is not real. This is just fear playing tricks on us." But terror does not need an invitation to be genuine. And the truth? The truth does not wait for permission before being recognized. It just is. They had stepped into something beyond their understanding, something far greater than them, something that did not conform to human will. Their whole universe. They wrapped their assurance around themselves like armor. They talked with assurance. They believed they had the upper hand. Shattered in a moment. There were no more whispered chats, smug smiles, or victorious looks exchanged. The arrogance that had formerly characterized them had vanished, leaving behind something raw, much more genuine. Survival. Because it was never their struggle to fight. This was never their battle to win. They mistook stillness for weakness. They had misled patience about approval. However, once past, certain lines make retreat impossible. Certain acts cannot be undone, and the cost of their miscalculation has already been determined. Some conflicts end before they even begin. And this wasn't just a defeat. This marked the end of their delusion. The instant they understood they'd never had control. And now they were not scheming. They were not colluding. They were not even thinking. They were running. Their minds swirled, searching for a way out. Will their demise be quick? Or would it extend with time, unraveling them piece by piece? Will their names fade? Their effect has been lost. Their legacy, rewritten into nothingness. The unknown yawned before them, vast and cruel, and for the first time, they worried what was beyond the next breath. One of them is usually the loudest. He parted his lips as if arguing or begging. However, stillness devoured his words before they could be formed. His voice had been captured. His logic was rendered ineffective in the face of something that communicated without having to be heard. Then comes clarity, not in pictures or words, but in something deeper, something unmistakable. They didn't just glimpse their future. They sensed it, the weight of their decisions, the route they had created. They had brought about their own catastrophe. Everything became as tangible as the earth beneath them. This was no warning. This was a predetermined consequence. We're merely waiting for their ultimate step. Stay and become absorbed. Leave to pray. They were still permitted to. Their bodies had already made the choice before their brains could comprehend it individually. Without saying anything, they turned away. They couldn't get away from the understanding that drove them. Some forces are impossible to overcome. Stop. Yes, you. This is not for everyone. Some will pass it by, unmoved, untouched. But if something within you stirs, if something in these lines tugs at your spirit, you know it's intended for you. Those who do not fit in and do not conform to the expectations imposed on them. Those who were never intended to remain quiet. Never intended to be ordinary. Some people stick to tried and true methods. But not you. You are the flaw in the illusion. The unyielding force. The uncontrollable storm. The world does not comprehend you because it was never intended to. But you don't exist. For their comfort, for their acceptance, for their approval, you stand out. Not because you want to, but because you were meant to. You're not here to fit in. You are here to succeed. They all broke at once. A disorganized swarm of frenetic activity, stumbling over themselves in their desperate attempt to leave. They had confidence. The hubris that had earlier guided their every choice had been stripped away, leaving just instinct. The primordial impulse to flee. The air hung to them, thick and oppressive, a memory of what had occupied that space only seconds before. Some fled into the darkness, pushing onward without direction, propelled solely by the hope that the distance would erase what had occurred. Others slumped over, grasping their chests and battling against an unseen weight that refused to let them go. One toppled, completely frozen in place. His mind couldn't connect the reality he had just observed with the world he had previously believed in. None of them dared to hesitate, question, or glance back, since whatever lay between them was not something to be confronted. It was something to be endured. And as they raced, the reality sank in slowly and painfully. This wasn't simply the failure of a plot or the unraveling of a meticulously planned falsehood. This was far worse. A message was delivered, one that required no more explanation. A few people were shook to the core. They spoke phrases they hadn't said in years, seeking consolation from something larger than themselves. They were unsure if their petitions would be heard. Others, refusing to succumb to the fright, attempted to persuade themselves that what they had seen was nothing more than panic, an illusion caused by fear, but no denial could alter the fact. They had gone beyond the bounds of what should have been left alone. Worse, they'd been permitted to depart, not because they battled or won, but because kindness had been shown. The darkness took them entirely, yet the event left an indelible stamp on their existence. And regardless of how far they ran, one truth would haunt them forever. They had faced up against something impenetrable, and they were permitted to go away not as conquerors, but as people who had been spared the world outside, carrying on as if nothing had happened. They knew better. Routine became a performance, a frantic effort to recover the normality that had been taken away from them. However, no amount of faking could erase the impression made on them. What transpired that night was more than just a nightmare. It was a wound that refused to heal, and the impression was too deep in their awareness to disappear. Sleep turned against them. Every time they closed their eyes, the memory came back, not in fragmented shards, but in full, unmistakable clarity. The unnatural quiet and rapid change in the environment. The moment their confidence turned to terror, the voice, it didn't just haunt their nightmares. It stayed within them, woven into the very fabric of their existence. An invisible weight bears down with unrelenting power. Some awoke gasping for oxygen, trapped in phantom hands that refused to let them go. Others looked blankly at the ceiling, refusing to submit to sleep, knowing that as soon as they wandered, it would be waiting. Even in daylight, the recollection stuck to them. Shadows became longer than before. Silence seemed too dense, and an unshakable presence loomed. Nor frightening, nor nasty, but always attentive. They avoided each other. The friendship they previously enjoyed has been destroyed beyond repair. They were the same folks who had formerly confided in each other. Now they barely met one another's sight. There was nothing else to say. They'd all been there. They'd all felt it. They all understood. Some attempted to drown it out with noise, diversions, loud music, and indulgences that numbed the edges of their thinking. However, quiet had transformed into a prism since the truth was always shown in the stillness. The echoes of that night cannot be ignored. One of them, the proudest, the one who had always led, SAT sat at his desk and stared at his own hands. The vibrations didn't stop. He clenched his hands, attempting to smash the weakness out of his bones. But deep down, he knew this couldn't be thrown off. Not anything that could be rationalized away. Another, a guy who had never said a prayer before, found himself unable to create words. Speak into the abyss. I'm not sure whether he was even being heard. But he knew one thing. If what they observed was true, everything he had based his life on was a lie. They could not understand it. There were no sensible reasons or logical explanations to mitigate what had happened. This was not a panic. It wasn't hysteria. It hadn't been an illusion. It was genuine. They'd all felt it. They had all overheard it. The most horrifying thing was that they had been permitted to depart. Not because they outmaneuvered anything. Not because they earned their freedom, but because something let them go. That information sank deep, snaking around their brains, like an unsaid warning. And in their quiet times alone, the awareness gnawed at them mercilessly. What had entered that night had terminated them before they could even begin, and they would never dare to re-examine their previous ideas. You did not have to defend yourself at all. However, you were guarded by an unknown power and enclosed by a barrier. No scheme, subterfuge, or whispered conspiracy could penetrate as they spent sleepless hours plotting their strategy. The reaction had already been planned before they even spoke your name in secret. The route had been chosen. They felt they were in control and were closing in. But, in reality, they had walked right into a power beyond their understanding. What they perceived for weakness was never anything less than an impenetrable wall, an invisible barrier between you and their objectives. The stillness they had accepted as consent had never been indifferent. It was the stillness before everything changed. And when the time came, when they thought their plans had fully come together, they were not greeted with opposition from you. They were halted by something considerably larger, something they had never anticipated. The anxiety they felt was more than simply fear of being exposed. It was the weight of realization. Every quiet discussion, every move was conducted in secret. Every meticulously planned move had been obvious all along. The concealed had been revealed. Their goals were turned to dust under an unwavering stare. They'd persuaded themselves you were their opponent. The war was theirs to win, but they had unintentionally entered a conflict that was never theirs to wage. You'd never been alone. You never had to retaliate. Because people who have a purpose do not stroll unattended. There are forces that stand. Watch. Simon, on the other hand, is immovable, sheltering without recognition and acting well before harm approaches. Battles are designed to shatter. You were disassembled before you even realized they existed. Threats that should have gained traction were suppressed before they could emerge. No power on the scene or unseen could change what had already been determined. They'd tried. They'd failed. And now they bear the burden of that failure. Deep inside them, everything they intended for your demise simply pushed you onward. They had spoken, planned, and waited for the time you would fall, certain that their plan would be the one to succeed. They saw themselves as triumphant. Imagine their hands having the ability to take you from where you stood. But they never grasped this. Nothing can stop what is already in motion. Their fixation with your failure was evidence of what you carried, confirmation of their worst fears. No one attempts to demolish anything unimportant. Nobody fights against something that has no worth. Their eagerness to see you fail was the clearest indication that you had already won. Because individuals without authority pose no danger. And the fact that they tried so hard demonstrates just one thing. You're unstoppable. They believed they had control, that their deceit was sufficient to change the course of events. They felt their manipulation would change the narrative, that their treachery would weaken you, and that their efforts would tip the scales in their favor. Instead of impeding your advance, they pushed you on by attempting to impede your way. They inadvertently became the driving force behind your development. They wanted to silence you. However, in their effort to silence your voice, they made it echo louder. The purpose was to break you, but all they managed to accomplish was uncover a fact they had never contemplated. You can't be broken. This is the paradox of opposing people who are called. Every assault designed to knock them down becomes the same fuel that propels them forward. It's always worked this way. The more resistance they confront, the higher they soar, and the more opposition they face, the more unstoppable they grow. History has often confirmed this. Because what is decreed cannot be undone, what was supposed to be destroyed becomes elevated. It cannot be revoked by any force. No treachery can change this. No strategy can take it. Once a purpose is established, it cannot be reversed by human intervention. They fooled themselves that they had control over your fate, yet their plans were nothing but whispers borne away by the wind. The facts never worked in their advantage. You were never the one at danger. They were. Because the instant they turned against you, they inadvertently fought something much beyond their comprehension. And now, while they deal with the fallout, you go on not as a victim of their plans, but as someone undisturbed by them, standing at a place they could never reach. You stay unshaken. You go forth with conviction. And those who previously thought they could control your fate are now powerless, seeing their efforts disintegrate to nothing. Move confidently. You are encircled by a power that cannot be defeated. Let them whisper. Let them plan. Allow them to labor in the shadows. Convince them that their acts will stay concealed. It will never alter what has been written. You don't stand alone. You never have. With every stride you take, and every conflict you face, there is protection, moving ahead of you, beside you, behind you. These are not your responsibilities to carry. These are not your wars to win. What rises against you is not limited to a single individual. It opposes the exact energy that has summoned you, the unstoppable strength that protects you. That's why their schemes fail. That is why their strength dwindles. That is why, once all is said and done, you remain standing. They are left to deal with the consequences of their own actions. Never dread what is planned in secret. The truth always comes to light, and justice never sleeps. Keep walking. Keep standing. Continue pushing ahead. No force can reach what has been sealed. No effort against you will succeed. And let them all come to a perfect understanding of one thing. Those selected do not form.